Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today on warehouse slotting. We'll be discussing the strategies and tools for best-of-breed slotting practices. I'm Steve Simonson. I lead the strategy and warehouse consulting practice here at Alpine Supply Chain Solutions, and I'll be your moderator today. With me today are also Deepan Kasturi and Jim Chamberlain, our slotting experts. While the webinar is active, you will be muted, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat or the Q&A, and I will be monitoring those and will break in to ask our panelists. Just a quick disclaimer, this information provided today is purely informational and educational. It is not intended to be a recommendation by Alpine. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenter, Deepan Kasturi.
Hey everyone, I'm Deepan Kasturi. I'm a data manager here at Alpine. Been here like almost 7 years now. I've done 100+ storage step analysis and slotting projects for varieties of customers around the US and Canada. And I'm excited to present the webinar to you. And I have Jim Chamberlain as my co-host.
Good afternoon, everybody. Jim Chamberlain. I'm Senior Managing Director at Alpine. And like Deepan, I've done hundreds of slotting engagements. And it's very exciting for us to talk to you about slotting today because even though it may seem somewhat one-dimensional, there are so many different factors that go into slotting. And each slotting solution is unique based on individual customer needs. So today, we're going to kind of talk you through how we approach it and a lot of the different ins and outs related to slotting. So excited to have everybody here. All right, so for our agenda, we're first going to do a slotting overview. What is slotting? Why do you slot? What are the benefits of slotting? Why it matters, core principles and factors that affect slotting. We'll review the Alpine way, and that's really our approach, our phased approach to the solutions for each client. And I mentioned it's unique. It could be, hey, we want to just focus on productivity. We want to focus just on accuracy. We want to make sure we're safe. We want to make sure we got the proper ergonomics. There's all sorts of things that go into a solution. And with the tools that we're going to talk to you about, you'll see that it's very mathematically based and it's easy to compare your as is to your to be solution. We'll give you some examples after we go through how we approach slotting so that you can see some real world before and after solutions. We'll talk through also, what are the different types of slotting, the different methodologies, when should you reslot? Also talk about what are some of the key performance indicators that you can use to show how your slotting solution is actually improving your overall performance and driving dollars to your bottom line. And then it's also good to talk through what are some of the common pitfalls found during slotting projects. We want to make sure you can kind of learn from us and things we've seen and learned along the way. And then we'll wrap it up with conclusions. And please do ask questions as we go through the presentation. We're happy to stop and to answer those as we go. All right, so the slotting overview, first off, we just wanted to define, what do we mean when we talk about slotting in a warehouse? And it's really broken down to this simple sentence. It's the systematic process of determining the most efficient locations for each SKU. So that sounds very simple at the top level, but like I mentioned, a lot of different things can go into what that most efficient location for each SKU represents. And like I said, it's a unique thing for each client. And so what are the goals of slotting? This is not an exhaustive list, but we want to increase space utilization by making sure that your forward pick locations are sized appropriately so that you're maximizing utilization within each one of those forward pick locations. We've all been in warehouses where you walk through and you see the product and then you see a bunch of air and then you see the beam for the next level. What we're trying to do with slotting is make sure we've got the right marriage of the amount of inventory and the actual slot sizes. We want to increase picking efficiency, minimize congestion in pick zones. So even though we may say, hey, we want to have your faster items closer to your dock, we don't want to have them all jam packed together and have everybody, creating a bottleneck in your aisles. So we look at the congestion minimization. We want to improve inventory control. Sometimes when we go into facilities, we'll see more than one SKU in a given location. So we're trying to have that one-to-one ratio of SKUs and locations to minimize any inventory issues. We want to focus on the ergonomics also. So the bend and reaches, making sure you utilize the golden zone between your knees and your shoulders for your majority of your picks. And then ultimately, this all, if it's done right, will result in reduced labor costs through reduction in overtime, improved productivity. Just a lot of these items that I went through rolled up to reduce your overall cost. So now I'm going to turn it over to Deepan, and he's going to walk you through in detail our approach and the different aspects that you need to take into consideration when slotting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jim. That was awesome. So I'll start with why slotting matters. So Jim just explained what is slotting and the benefits of it. So why actually slotting matters? So you might have a warehouse today where pickers might be using equipment to pick the items, or you might have all pick locations where actually pickers actually walk and get the items from. So it might be either of those, but the travel is actually the biggest impact of any picking time. So 50 to 70% is the best practice of anywhere from 50 to 70% is the pick time just for the warehouse travel. So within the travel itself, if we do proper slotting, the travel distance actually reduces by 30%. So we talked about 70% of the total time being the travel. And within that 70%, if we solve for the 30%, that's going to be a lot of labor cost reduction. And as Jim said, it has more impacts other than just the labor cost, like ergonomics and throughput efficiency. And at the same time, it also has a bigger impact on customer satisfaction, because if you reduce your travel time and if you're able to get more throughput out of your building, that reaches your customer more faster. A 2-day SLA becomes a 1-day SLA, or a 3-day SLA becomes a 2-day SLA. So customer satisfaction is also a main thing that slotting will also touch on. The next one that I wanted to touch base is the core principles of why slotting is, and the next one is the key factors that affect slotting that most of the people do not know. It might be very simple, but those are the key factors that actually affects the slotting. So when we talk about core principle, there are 4 core principles: proximity, accessibility, compatibility, and adaptability. So proximity, I think Jim again touched on it already. High movers close to the pick ship areas, right? So as much as close they are to the ship stations, my travel distance reduces. But at the same time, we don't want everything in 1 or 2 aisles that causes congestion. So with the slotting tool, we'll be able to say, hey, this is how much we would be able to put it in 1 aisle, and let's spread it across different aisles at the same time, reducing the travel distance. So reaching the product is one, that is proximity. Then at the location, how can you reduce the time of picking? So if I'm actually bending and taking a product, or if I'm actually reaching and taking a product, that is like 1 or 2 seconds extra than picking it from a golden zone. So we do golden zone slotting, again depending upon the customer type and the SKUs that the customer has. And this accessibility varies. So we can do golden zone based slotting, or we can do wedge strategy, where all your fast moving items will be in just the first 2 bays, and then the farthest you travel, it will be your slowest item. So we talked about how to travel proximity and accessibility when you're in front of that location. The next one is the compatibility. So sometimes there will be SKUs that you actually order together. So we'll actually look at your order profile and the SKU analysis to say, hey, these items are ordered together on 80% or 90% of the orders. So we'll probably place those 2 items together, so that when a person actually goes there and pick the first item, the second item is next to each other, so that the travel time between both of the SKUs gets reduced, or it's cut into, cut by 90%. So the final one is the adaptability. So all these things we can do and set you up for slotting. The next one is seasonality and the new items. So we need to also take into account if you have very seasonal factor, for example, a Black Friday sale, or a school opening zone, or it might be New Year's. So all these things should be taken into account when we perform slotting. And at the same time, we're not having all the SKUs and all the years. So new versions come out, new SKUs come in, and acquisition happens from one building to the other. So all these things have to be taken into account when we perform slotting, which Alpine can help with. So those are the basic core principles. And at the same time, I want to include the key factors. So the main factors, again, I said it earlier, all these are simple. Every client will have it. Some clients don't, but these are the main things that affect slotting greater time, which is, you should always consider SKU velocity, which is the demand frequency. So we usually ask for 1 year's worth of orders so that we can see the peak and value of your business. And at the same time, every SKU, as I said, has seasonal factor affecting it. So we will not be slotting your warehouse for your peak season, or we'll not just do it based on average. So every SKU has its own hybrid nature. So we'll look into SKU velocity. That's one of the main things. And the next one is the product size and weight. So product dimensions is a major factor because the tool that we actually use, the slotting software that we use at Alpine, it considers the 3-dimensional factor. You can put in orientation restrictions, you can put in weight restrictions of where it should be slotted in, and that takes a bigger impact towards ergonomics and at the same time utilization of the racking. So if you do not have product dimensions and weight, this is probably the good time to go and measure it. And at the same time, Alpine can help you with a cubing project to go ahead and measure dimensions and capture weights of the items too. The next one is if you have any kind of storage mediums like the racking, starting with the bin shelvings or case flow or pallet locations, hand stacks, push packs, everything is really important. So we need to capture what is a pickable location versus what is just for overstock or reserve location, so that we'll capture those and then we'll include that in our digital twin when we prepare the digital twin for our slotting project. And I talked about digital twin, which actually I'll show a picture that represents how a digital twin is prepared. The next one is the order profile. So we talked about velocity, we talked about size, and at the same time, how products are being ordered. Is it single line and e-commerce type of orders, or is it single line retail type of orders? So all those order profile analysis will also be completed before we go ahead and slot the items, because based on the order profile, Alpine will be suggesting the type of slotting that will work for our customers. And lastly, equipment and pick type. So as I said earlier, picking method can be different for every client. You might be using equipment going from one location to the other location, like a pallet jack or a walkie rider or a very narrow aisle order picker, or you can just have a mezzanine walking from one location to the other location, or you can pick to belt, or it can be pick to light. So all these type of medias, or even you can have goods to person technology within your own warehouse. So all these picking methods and equipment that you use for picking will also play an important factor when we perform the slotting analysis.
So one thing that Deepan mentioned was compatibility. There's also a term incompatibility, and some of our clients, if they are dealing with errors, mispicks within the warehouse, may say, I don't want these boxes that have the same look to them with only maybe a different size for a glove or a different color for something to be directly next to each other. So we can even get down to, when we're doing iterations, doing separation so that we help the pickers not to arrive at a location and maybe get confused with which item they should be picking. So a lot of different things we can take a look at.
Yeah, that's true. And we call that, as Jim said, like item separation or item separation that can be done together. Yep. All right. So we talked about, why slotting matters, core principles of it. Now we'll talk about the Alpine way. So Alpine has a phase-based approach for performing a slotting project for our customers. So these are not the phases, but these are the highlights of what we actually do. And we start with the data, and whenever we get the data, we get most of the data from our clients, starting from outbound, inbound, item master, location master, inventory snapshots, and anything that our client can get, we'll take it, because we never say no to data. That's one key important factor that Alpine deals with. Once we gather the data, then we'll perform the analysis. So as I said earlier, we'll look at the peak, non-peak, and we might land on a peak analysis. We might land on a hybrid, depending upon how much growth that you're actually planning to do in the upcoming years, because that also helps slotting to be successful. And we'll talk about how much worth of quantity am I putting in a pick location. Do I want 1 week's worth? Do I want all my quantity of a C item in a pick location so that I reduce my replenishments? And sometimes an A item might be 50 pallets a week. It depends. So we have a client who ships like 100 pallets every week, and that's an A item for them. Are we planning to put 100 items, 100 pallets in a pick location? Probably not, because we're going to put 10 pallets in a pick and have more replenishments per week, because we know there will be AA moving items for all businesses. And depending upon how it moves, we'll probably touch on replenishment or increase replenishments for those items instead of increasing the travel pick path enormously. And then we'll also finalize the pain points after we visit the site. It might be, all items stored together, as Jim said. If you want like item separation, I have same item but with different colors. There are mispicks happening, so I want all those items to be separated. You might have conveyors, or you might have zone routing. So all those things will be taken into effect. So I know I did not touch on ABC analysis, which is the main factor before we go into the next step of the slotting. So we have shown a right side table as an example. So we called it as A as the fast moving item, B is a medium moving item, and C will be a slow moving item. We can define ABC based on any number of ways. It can be cube, it can be lines or hits, or how many times a picker actually visit that location, or it can be quantity that you move. Again, depending upon the business, if it is a retail business, we do it differently. If it is an e-commerce business, we do it differently. So every time it will be different. And majorly for slotting, we'll be dealing with percent of picks or lines. So 20% of your SKUs contributing 80% of picks. So if we place those 20% of your SKUs in appropriate locations, then we are solving for 80% of the picks. We will still solve for the 80% of the remaining SKUs, but the impact is very, very low. So if you're just redesigning your current warehouse or reslotting your current warehouse, our most important thing to reslot will be the 20% of the items. But we'll still take a look at the others to see how much cost benefit is it going to give us. If it's not worth making a move, then we will suggest not to make a move, but next time integrate with your WMS so that when you do put away, it might actually redirect to a different location. So once we do the ABC and all other data analysis, after we finalize what is the data that is going to impact slotting, then we will start with a strategy for the slotting. So when I say strategy, we do have locations, all pick locations. We'll develop XYZ coordinates, all pickable locations, and we'll start building our digital twin. Again, I do have visual example of how a digital twin looks, but that's the starting point within the slotting software, how a digital twin actually looks. After we finalize the locations and after we complete the digital twin, then we'll go into the iterations mode and we'll perform the slotting results for you. So we'll not just do one slotting scenario. We wanted to do multiple scenarios so that we can compare scenario to scenario each other in terms of real cost savings, because without the cost saving comparison, there is very minimal that you can actually say this is what changes between scenario 1 and 2. We'll also do a current slotting, which will actually provide you with, hey, this is how much I am spending today in my warehouse for picking. And scenario 1 saves you X%, scenario 2 saves you X%. We'll also show you where it actually saves. Is it traveling because of bend and reach, saving because of bend and reach, or saving because of travel? So all those things will be noted down. And we, as a team, as a collective team, we should be able to come to a conclusion that this is the slotting result that we want to proceed forward with. Once we finalize that, then Alpine will help you develop the moves list. So if you're reslotting within your warehouse, it is tough to move products from one place to another. So as a collective team, we'll define the date and the time of the move, and at the same time, what products to move, how much quantity to move, what location from location. Everything will be discussed and provided the moves list. And this moves list can be delivered every day or every week, depending upon how fast the customer can actually react, making the physical moves in the building. So this is the
Hey,
way of doing the project.
hey, Deepan, we've got a couple questions that have come through.
Yep.
I'm going to throw them your way. It says, when you referenced data, is it just the product and location sizing, or is it the history and or forecasting data as well?
So I'd say everything has its own importance. So when I said earlier, dimensions are the most important thing. The next one, if you have location dimensions, that's awesome. If not, Alpine can help you capture both item and the location dimensions. The next part or the next side of it is we have to choose either or. If you have good forecasting information, Alpine would be suggesting to use the forecasting information going forward. But when we perform the slotting scenario, we'll be using your previous data, your shipping data, so that we can compare this is actual spend on the labor for picking. And then this will be your, this might have been your spend on picking if we do scenarios. So all the data points that you mentioned, Jim, is fairly equal importance.
How far
And
back
then
in the historical data do you go?
We usually get 1 year's worth so that we can understand the business much better, understand peaks and valleys much better to suggest, a data point for the future.
Okay.
All right. So we'll go into some of the project examples that we have done in the past. So I know we have mentioned only 6 different customers. As Jim and I said, we have worked for 100 different customers at the same time, 100 different projects around the storage step analysis and slotting. And these are some of the important ones that we have done recently. So school supply customer, a footwear customer, office supply, medical equipment, pet medicine, and then apparel industry. So all these customers have their own problems, have their own seasonality, because school supplies and office supplies, their peak actually begin in June and July, and it ends immediately. But for footwear, it's going to be Black Friday sale or every sale that is happens within a year. And with apparel and footwear, their products actually change every week. So this footwear client that we worked with, they bring in 10 to 20,000 SKUs every week as a replacement item or a new version or a new item that comes in. So it's, it has to have a big impact on slotting. So as far as pick type, we work for both each picks and case picks. Some has inner pack picks or pallet picks, which might not have a big impact on slotting, but each and case pick will do. And then as far as number of SKUs, you can see from the list, we have worked with clients who have 200 items until 100 to 150,000 SKUs within slotting. And then as far as the building type also, we can help you with the reslotting of your existing building or going to a new building so that you have right spot to put your new SKUs or your existing SKUs in the right location so that you save time on travel. So as far as estimated savings and the percentage, those are not, comparable from client to client. Every client has their own percentage and own savings per year. The biggest that we have seen is the footwear client. As I said, they bring in 10 to 20,000 SKUs every week. So we were able to save about $450,000. This was just for one of their buildings. And with this savings that they realized immediately after a couple of months, we were able to slot their second and the third building that they opened recently. So and at the same time they also purchased the software that we recommended. So their software is integrated with their WMS, the tier 1 WMS that they already have, and Alpine helped them negotiate and price up the software too. So these are some of the examples that we did recently.
We got one more question out there.
Yep.
What benefit would come if slotting before a WMS go live?
Jim, do you want to take that question?
That the question was the benefits of slotting before a WMS go
Before a
live.
WMS, yeah, before a
Yes.
WMS go live.
Okay. So yeah, so if you do slotting before the WMS go live, then your WMS should have a bigger impact on when to replenish, how much to replenish, and which location am I replenishing. And depending upon the customer type, we might do static slotting, or it might be a random slotting. So if it is a random slotting, for example, I'll show you an example in the upcoming slides. So if it is a random slotting, which means we select a zone and call that as an A moving item zone. So if your WMS has a capacity or capability to find an item zone and uses time, you have WMS go live upcoming.
And on a similar note, if you're going to be moving to a new facility, doing slotting before you actually get into the building is a great opportunity because you have to touch the product anyway when you're moving it from facility A to facility B. And to be able to put it in the optimal location in your new building based on your slotting solution, it's a great opportunity to do it at that point also.
Yep. So as I said, project examples that Alpine worked with. So this is our office supply customers. So the left side, varieties of racking. So they had case flow, they had bin shelving, they had bins over the conveyors. So all these racking was already there. So we did not build any racking, but when we perform the slotting, so this is what I said the current slotting is. So they do have the red ones are the top items that the pickers actually visit frequently. And you can see the red ones are actually spread across their pick zones. Most bays were not completely optimized. It's not 100% used. And with this, the travel time that they had was, more than what they should have been doing. And this was the scenario that we landed on. So we performed, I believe, 5 to 6 different scenarios after analyzing what pain points that they faced and how many zones there were. And you can see the reds are actually grouped together in particular zones, meaning they do have allocated pickers in every zone. And since they have conveyors, they have zone routing and automated conveyors that actually takes to the particular zone. So every zone has its own picker. And now since the reds are all together, the travel time and bend and reach has enormous impact towards their labor cost reduction. So this was one of the examples that I wanted to mention. And the another one that I wanted to mention is the footwear client. So I talked about footwear client being the more SKUs, and at the same time, both each and case picking side of things. So this slide also shows you that the red ones are actually spread across. And this was a case pick type of scenario with an equipment or the order picker, and the same time, pallet jacks and walkie riders for the bottom level locations. And the left top was the area where they actually had the pack stations and all automations related to packing. And you can see the left top is actually kind of empty right now. And at the same time, the reds are all everywhere. So after we perform the slotting for this footwear client, you can see the red ones are actually targeted towards the left top. And at the same time, we did not put all the reds in just 1 or 2 aisles. So it is actually kind of spread out evenly, and based on how many pickers can actually enter 1 or 2 aisles. So that has taken a big impact on their labor reduction because the travel time was reduced enormously, around like 25 to 30%. Travel was reduced because of this reslotting exercise. And this is where we did not make all the moves. So top, I believe 100 to 200 items were moved immediately. The next ones, we waited for the inventory to deplete and we let the WMS decide where that item should go. So this was the random slotting environment. They also had a WMS go live before we slotted this slotting. And with that WMS go live, we were able to merge this slotting software along with their tier 1 WMS. And now, along with both of the tools, they're saving a lot with their travel time because of the slotting exercise. All right. So those are some of the examples in terms of visual on how a slotting exercise will look like. And that's the one that I actually referenced as the digital twin. So you might have an AutoCAD of the building, or you might have, a drawing of the building from any tool. And this is what we draw within our tool using the XYZ coordinates. So we build this digital twin within the tool. So I did talk about the slotting methods a little bit earlier. So there are three types of slotting methods that we actually have done in the past, which is a fixed slotting, where you have a permanent location for each and every SKU that you have in the building, and you replenish from your overstock or from your reserve location to that permanent pickable location. The next one is a random slotting. So random slotting is the system driven, and at the same time, the WMS and the slotting software will speak to each other so that it provides the location for this queue when you receive it or when you're trying to replenish it to a permanent location. Sorry, a random location. The next one is the hybrid. So the footwear client that I was mentioning earlier, we did a hybrid solution. When I say hybrid, a part of their business is e-commerce, which is 20 to 30% of their business is e-commerce. So for the e-commerce side of business, we did the fixed slotting scenario. And meanwhile, their case picking is to replenish to their stores, which is 70 to 75% of their total business. That's where the majority of the travel was because they're using equipment. So we did a random slotting for that. So that building had a hybrid slotting. So it's a mix of both based on velocity, and at the same time, some other factors will come into play too. And then when should you reslot? So this is probably the most asked question to Alpine. When should I reslot my building? So there are major things that will be happening in your building that you can consider that as the time for reslot when you have a seasonal demand. So for example, if a Black Friday sale is coming up, which is a month from now it's a good time to reslot immediately so that you have the list ready with your forecasting team. We know what items are going to sell a lot so that you can be prepared and reslot your items for your season so that your travel time will be reduced. Next, new products, right? So when you have new products, you should have space within your warehouse for both pick and reserve. So for picking, we'll let you know where to reslot. If it is actually going to a location where already a SKU exists, we'll find a new location for the SKU that is in that place. The next one is the volume spikes. So we talked about, a season, and at the same time, volume spikes are a little different. You might have an item that is a C moving item today that moves like 5 per week. And tomorrow or day after, a sale goes on, that volume just, jumps up to 100, jumps up 50 to 60%. Depending upon the sale, the volume spikes are really, really important that you can reslot within. Again, if you have forecasting information, that would be great. If not, then we can actually use historical data to figure out. The next one is a space constraint. So if you don't have a proper vertical space utilization with your pickable locations, then that is one of the important factors to reslot also. So if you don't have any of this, the last one to look at is the poor slotting performance. So if you don't know how to look at it, just go inside your warehouse, start observing how my pickers are traveling from one fast moving item to the next one. Are they traveling less? Are they traveling more? You can see if they're traveling more, that's a slotting issue. If you have customer complaints on higher pick error rates, that's again a slotting issue that you don't want similar items together, and at the same time you don't want um, items to be slotted together should not be separated. So all those things. And then if you're seeing 5 or 6 pickers in the same aisle, or if you're seeing a picker waiting for another picker to move out of that particular zone, that's a congestion. So we need to solve for that congestion also. And during these spikes, during these seasonal changes, there will be more replenishment. So even after Alpine slots your building, for example, we will have more replenishment, but it should not be increasing by 100%, or it should not be increasing it by 200%. So we'll solve for your replenishment. So if you have excessive replenishment issues, you should be taking slotting into effect. We do sell another project called storage step analysis that is exclusively just for solving your replenishment and space issues also. And then, as I already said, underutilized vertical space. And then if you don't have proper replenishments happening, and if it is too much to keep up, then obviously your forward pick is going to stock out. You will not have products in the forward pick, and that will cause issues downstream. So all these things are related to poor slotting. So make sure you go ahead and validate all these things. And this, if you see any one of these happen in your warehouse today, that's when you reslot your building. All right, so we'll jump into the slotting KPIs. So these are some of the important ones, and as Jim said earlier, there will be more depending upon the business. There might be some unique ones that we might want to add. So we do have some 6 to 7 KPIs that we feel that is important. Sometimes you might have cost per unit as one of your KPI that you measure within your warehouse. We can still add it based on the client and based on the measurement that you already do. The major one that we see is the pick rate. So the picker efficiency should go up. It should not go down, right? So pick efficiency is one of the things. Travel time, it should go down. So if you have lower travel time, that means you have items in better locations. And order accuracy. So if you have complaints from your customers that you have, missed picks or anything such as that, then that's again a time for reslotting. The outer accuracy should be higher so that slotting is working. That's a good sign. And then space utilization, how well you're utilizing your space. It should be perfectly utilized. It should not be over or underutilized. And then we did talk about replenishment frequency, how you refill your pick location, how often do you do. And at the same time, with bad slotting, if I need a case flow location, which is a 96-inch deep, I should put it in a case flow. I should not put it in a bin location, because that will cost you 4 to 5 times additional replenishments, which causes again more labor. Finally, all these things translate into one big thing, which is labor cost. So labor cost is going to be a major impact to any of the warehouse. So if you fail in one of these top ones, your labor cost per order is going to go up. So we definitely need to increase the labor cost with the slotting tool. And finally, touches per order. So we don't want multiple touches. So if you're mispicking or mishandling your item, we need more touches on that item. So we don't want more touches for any order that you're doing, which again can be solved using the slotting process.
And like Deepan's kind of alluding to here on the last two slides, the objective is a holistic solution. So it's not one dimensional where it just focuses on travel. It's looking at, all the different things associated with picking. And the overall solution that provides the lowest cost operation is what we're going for. And that may mean that there are certain puts and takes within each one of these categories where some have to give in order to, get. So very interesting when you start to view it at that holistic level. The solution becomes a lot more dynamic, but it's also one that has the biggest impact.
All right, so we'll look at the top 10 common pitfalls that we have found, our customers do that when they do their own slotting. They don't use real data. They just rely on the guts of the people who are out on the floor to see whether if this is a faster item, this is a slower item. Don't use real-time data. Do not use very outdated data. So as I said, we'll get the latest 1 year's worth to see the peak and valley, but we'll not use the entire one full year to reslot your building. We'll take your latest a month or two to reslot your building or your forecasted data. So don't rely on your gut feeling. Use real-time data. And then one-time slotting project with no reevaluation. So as we talked on the previous slides, there are key performance indicators that you can measure. And Alpine also has success metrics when we kick off of a slotting project. So that needs to be measured immediately after the slotting moves are complete. So if you're doing just a one-time slotting thing without evaluation, then that's not going to work out really good. And at the same time, SKU velocity. So as I said, do not rely on your gut feeling, rely on real-time data in terms of dimensions and SKU velocity. And if you have real good forecasting information, that's the best that you can ask for in terms of velocity. And then product dimensions. So if you have, for example, if you have 50% of your items have dimensions today, we'll see if those 50% of the items contribute what percent of the lines or orders. And if that is 50-50, then we will be measuring more items to get to a, we'll not recommend you to measure 100%, because that's obviously going to take time to measure your C and D items, but at least your A's and the B's that has a major impact in terms of travel time should be measured. And then replenishment efforts. So someone should be looking at replenishments to see, why am I replenishing more than a week, or more than a day. So if that replenishment is actually causing you more labor, then you should be reslotting. So just don't take easily on your replenishments also. And if you have, as I said initially, zone slotting, making sure that you do zone slotting within your warehouse. And at the same time, if you have equipment to pick from, pick path should be determined. So it can be implemented in your WMS also as the pick path, so that when a picker goes from one location to the next location, it is an optimized pick path. The next one is ignoring seasonality. So as I said earlier, seasonality has a major impact in terms of travel time and replenishments. So do not ignore seasonality or promotional items. And then lack of employee involvement. So if you change anything within your warehouse, reslotting or moving items from one location to the reserve completely because it has become a D item, or you might introduce any promotional items, making sure your employees are up to date in terms of training and involvement is also gonna play a major impact. You might have a WMS today that you might not know if you have a feature involved in it or not as far as slotting. Let us know. Again, we do have a WMS systems team that deals with this separately apart from our warehousing team. So they can also take a look at your WMS to see whether if you have the feature, or how much is it going to cost you to add the feature, all those things. And we can also help you do that. And at the same time, you might have a slotting tool today, or you might not. It might be just, traditional Excel based method slotting. So if you have a slotting tool, make sure you're utilizing it. Alpine can help you fix it. And at the same time, we can develop a slotting tool for you by using our tool and giving it to you, and you can maintain it, or Alpine can help you maintain it as a slotting as a service also. And finally, always measure slotting. So when you perform a slotting, it might be just for 2 items, or it might be for 2,000 items. Always measure what it is saving you in terms of travel time, in terms of the total labor cost reduction. Sometimes slotting will hit you in reverse. For example, you might put a really good item, it might be in a good location already, and you might be moving into another good location which might not have any effect, or it might have a negative impact too. So that's why using a slotting tool is very, very beneficial. All right, perfect. So now I would hand it over to Jim and Steve for concluding the webinar.
All right, let's take it home. Thank you, Deepan. Tons of great information around slotting, and you're just hitting the tip of the iceberg. I know there's so many details, but what are our key takeaways from today's webinar? Effective slotting boosts picking speed, accuracy, and space utilization. 3 key components within a facility. Data-driven strategies are the way to go. Taking a look at all the items, all the attributes, and you even hit it on the last slide there. If you have a long tail of slow-moving items, it may not make sense to move those at all because the juice isn't worth the squeeze, and that's something that the software can help with. Regular reslotting is critical. Every time new items come into your building, you should be looking to slot those in the right type of slots in the right locations in your building, so that you maximize those overall savings items that we discussed. Avoid the common pitfalls of using outdated data, ignoring certain components that drive costs, so that you're maybe gaining in one area but giving it up in another area, taking that holistic view. Use technology. The days of trying to slot using spreadsheets where you're just able to look at it one dimensionally. Those are outdated and they give you watered down solutions. So use the technologies that are out there. And final thoughts, uh, slotting, look at it as a strategic advantage. Most of the time when you're looking at your outbound activities within your facility, the pick function is where most of your money is. And if you can focus on things that's going to make those people's lives as easy as possible, make them as efficient as possible, that's going to be a win-win for you. And then finally, small changes can lead to big gains. I don't know if we talked about it, but when you do get the moves list, you can sort it in descending ROI value so that you do the moves that move the register the most first, and then you cascade down to those moves that have smaller and smaller impact. So if you're ready to optimize, start with a slotting project. You know, like I said, look in your warehouse. If most of your people are in the picking function, this is a great way to improve that. Leverage Alpine. We use tools, but we have tons of experience and decades of, you know, real world exposure that can help you along with your slotting journey. And then finally, continue to improve day in, day out to get better today than you were yesterday. So with that, we're going to open it up to any more questions.
I've got a good one here. How do you handle or consider order picking and building a solid pallet? Let's say you've got an A item, but it's very easily crushable or breakable, but you've got to build an outbound pallet going for delivery. How do you deal with that?
Yep. So we have worked for one of our clients who had chips. So chips are easily, breakable, and at the same time, it's an A item for them. So that's when we define the travel pick path. And then within the travel pick path, as Jim said earlier, the slotting is putting your items in the right locations. And we can actually put a place in there and say, I'm slotting it based on both reducing my travel time, and at the same time, I want a pallet build sequence. So if I do a pallet build sequence, it's going to put all my heavy items first, and then I'm picking my heavy items first. Then I'm going to slowly pick my light feather items at the last, so that the pallet build is safe.
Yep, and along with that, like Deepan's mentioning, we can get into even block patterns. So cases with the same height, length, width in the same areas so that it builds a natural palette for the pickers. And we do look at that cube and weight. So we're looking at density so that can be factored in so that the slot size handles the velocity and the stackability gets handled by looking at the cube and density of those items.
Great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Here we go. Do you take into account the picking flows when slotting? Is this something that will change?
We do actually take everything into account. Sometimes it might not have a bigger impact. Again, depending upon the products and the process that you follow, it might have a bigger impact too. So,
all right, another good question. Anyone else? All right. So this is our last in our series for 2025. We will be starting a new webinar series in 2026. We look forward to you joining on every one of those. So those will be coming up soon. We'll be putting out an agenda on that. If you have any questions about today or anything going forward, feel free to contact Paul Getter. His contact information is on the screen, and he can either answer your question or direct you to one of us to be able to answer your question or help you get an answer to that question. And with that, I conclude our slotting webinar for today. Thank you, everybody.